their communities are besieged and beset by violent crime, and they're no longer safe in the streets, in the neighborhoods, in their schools, even in their churches. And they're saying, we need the cops. We really need the cops. So I think with respect to defunding the police, that ship has sailed, and it's sailed long since.
This is a dangerous time for law enforcement, and it's created by people who are more interested in the problem than they are any solutions.
Never has it been harder to be a police officer in this country. We're going to take our voice back. We're going to become the national voice for law enforcement that we so desperately needed.
Stunning report from the National Fraternal Order of Police.
The Fraternal Order of Police, the world's largest police union.
Fraternal Order of Police.
The National Fraternal Order of Police.
Activist groups and others have done their very best to crumble us, and yet we stand.
We've never had a voice like this powerful before.
This is The Blue View, a podcast for the National Fraternal Order of Police. The years 2020 and 2021 have been a very difficult time for America's law enforcement. One thing we know for sure, it has been a never-ending, ever-changing challenge as we dealt with COVID, unrest, police reform, defunding, and rising crime. With us today is Jim Pasco, the Executive Director of the National Fraternal Order of Police, to talk about some of the activities taking place in Washington, D.C. on all of these fronts. This is the Blue View. Well, Jim, thanks for joining us today for Blue View.
I know
this has been some very difficult times, but you've seen it before here in Washington. This has been around for quite some time through ATF and here. Tell us a little bit about your journey that brought you to the FOP.
Oh, thanks, Pat. I got out of the Army in 1967 and went almost immediately to work for the U.S. Customs Service, and I had a really good job there. I was a young inspector trainee and felt like I had the world by the tail. The only drawback was that Customs was in one of their periodic reorganization studies, and as a result, they weren't promoting. It was a nationwide freeze on promotions. And being about 21, 22 years old and quite full of myself, which has, of course, changed, I felt like I should be getting promoted about every 2 weeks. And we were working a lot in those days with the guys from ATF, and they were rocking and rolling. The Gun Control Act had passed in 68, and they knew they were going to get a broader explosives jurisdiction in 1970, and they were hiring like crazy. And they said, come on over here. So I came over to ATF and started in Hartford, Connecticut, was sent almost immediately to New Haven, Connecticut, and then up to Boston. People kept trying to get rid of me. I never understood that. But after about a year or so, I said, I'd really like to work in Florida. And they said, well, you got to get your ticket punched in headquarters before you can go to Florida. So in 1972, I guess, I did my first tour in headquarters, thinking I'll get this done. I'll go to Florida and nobody will ever hear of me again. I'll be down there fishing. And it didn't work out that way. We had a reorganization at ATF. I ended up in the first congressional affairs office that ATF ever had, just because I was available and willing to give it a try. I fell in love with the work. I loved working for ATF, but I really had no idea what to expect in congressional. I really liked it. So I was only in there about a year and a half, and I spent pretty much the rest of my career in ATF until the point when I got back in congressional affairs, trying to get back into congressional affairs. And before I retired, I was promoted to assistant director for congressional and public affairs, and at a time when the attacks on ATF on the part of the NRA and the right were at their absolute highest ever, and there were tremendous challenges to our explosives and arson jurisdiction. And I ended up, just by accident of history almost, being deeply involved in the development of the 94 crime bill, Brady Law, the assault weapons ban, and effectively what ATF gave me the opportunity to do before I retired was to learn a trade. Otherwise, you would be more likely to see me as a grader at Walmart today than working here at the FOP. But during that last few years on the 94 crime bill, I worked closely with all of the police groups. But I saw in the FOP tremendous potential because of their nationwide, even then, their nationwide name recognition, the fact that they represented rank and file police officers from all parts of the country. And you had a president then in Dewey Stokes, who was physiologically incapable of being silent on any issue. So he was always out there, always in the press, and he really brought the FOP front and center among all the groups who were working on that critically important piece of legislation. And I thought, my God, this organization has boundless potential, and there were a lot of things about it that were like ATF. They're a law and order organization, but they had labor needs. So they couldn't ignore the Democrats and they couldn't ignore the Republicans. Well, it was the same with ATF. Normally, law and order uh, congressmen and senators are going to support law enforcement agencies. But because ATF enforced the gun laws, they didn't get that automatic support, and they needed to look to the Democratic Party. So I learned to work in a bipartisan way out of necessity at ATF. And when the opportunity came, my predecessor, the recently deceased Dick Boyd, a former national president, real presence on the Hill for ATF, decided that for health reasons, he wanted to go back to Oklahoma. Dewey Stokes, out of the blue, called me and offered me this job. And I said, well, I'll try it for 3 years, Dewey, and that's it. And I'm going to really retire. And obviously, I'm not that good at exit strategies. And the FOP is not that good at firing people because I'm still here.
That's because you do an amazing job, and I think a lot of it has to do clearly because of your longevity here in Washington. You know everybody, everyone knows you, and regardless of what party seems to be in control at any given time, what we have transcend, or what you have transcend, is that ability to not become politically partisan and focus more on the issues itself, which really leads us into where we are today. All of the challenges that law enforcement has faced in the last 2 years, and the struggles that we've had from COVID to defunding, to rising crimes, to police reform, the FOP has been a driving force with that. And it's been those good faith discussions that have allowed us to give voice to our members across this country, and how some of these changes that were proposed, how they would affect law enforcement as a whole. So I know that we've had good faith discussions both in Congress, both sides of the House, with both two administrations now. If you could just take us a little bit of a journey on how when the George Floyd incident occurred and the changes that we had, and how we find ourselves today now looking at a potential executive order coming out of the White House.
Okay, well, when the George Floyd event took place in Minneapolis, that kind of led to a rapid evolution in thinking and in political positioning on the part of a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans. Fortunately for us, we were not new to these debates at that point. While they didn't get the national focus of the national media that they began to get post George Floyd. They had been ongoing for some period of time. And we had been in conversations going back over a period of years, in fact, with the Black Caucus, with the NAACP, with other police organizations, including NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. So in our positions on these various issues were generally known, and we had been and continue to be consistent on those positions. And I think, getting back to your point, it's more than just longevity here in Washington. It's consistency and integrity in representing that are important to ongoing credibility and relevance as these crises occur. And make no mistake, I'm not trying to minimize the degree to which we've been in a crisis mode over the last couple of years or so, and we started um, the real accelerated and concentrated um, conversations on police reform, which had been ongoing to a degree pre George Floyd, at a whole new level post George Floyd. And we were talking even in those days to Senator Scott, as well as to Senator Booker, and numerous others in the Senate and in the House, with Congresswoman Bass, Congresswoman Val Demings of Florida, Cedric Richmond, who's now in the White House, who had a pivotal role in the Black Caucus at that time. So we hit the ground running, and there again we talked about the areas in which we felt we could find common ground, and the areas that constituted red lines for us, and they're very well known to this day because again those positions haven't changed. The doctrine of qualified immunity, 18 U.S.C. 242 on use of force. Our reliance on Graham v. Connor as the final law of the land, rather than, any instrument developed by state government or local government. Um, the 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 consensus use of force standards that we developed after having worked in close collaboration with the International Association of Chiefs. We had gotten together with a consortium of the largest police groups in the United States, and hammered for 2.5, 3 years to finally arrive at this consensus, which we still believe is a model for best practices for all departments across the country. And we have been among the key organizations in proselytizing that consensus use of force standard through the CRITAC grant, which IACP administers and a number of us participate in, and the good work that's been done by Keith Turney as our representative on CRITAC. So we had a good foundation. We had a reputation for consistency and for candor, and also for keeping confidence, because you can't have these negotiations, good faith negotiations, in the media. You can't have them in public, because then people are being pulled, and it's human nature to posture and to dig in your heels when dealing with the media. And you can't, if your positions are uniformly absolute, you can't negotiate. You end up well, you don't end up, you start in gridlock and you remain in gridlock. So we have been flexible where we could be at the front end, making people aware that we had certain red lines, but outside those lines, we were willing to talk and to compromise and try very hard to find common ground. So here we are.
So, I guess the powers we have in as law enforcement are directly related to that trust in the community. And we're all working very hard to try and strike that balance with it. And I think there's some misconceptions. There are a number of things in the Justice and Policing Act that are beneficial for law enforcement, and things that we have talked about and expressed our support and our concerns of others. If you could compare, I know you speak about the things that really, I guess if we summed it up, it would come down to, we're interested in having that open dialogue and finding some improvements, but it can't be at the stake of making our communities and our law enforcement officers who've taken this job less safe.
Right.
And that's kind of the category the two are put in. I know in Congress, we did. We hit a considerable headwind, and we're not able to get something meaningful passed so that we could get past this. And as a result, we see states coming up with their own legislation, trying to fill that void with it. But now we're facing an executive order potentially coming out of the White House. And I know that for quite some time, as you said, we were in those discussions, but again, kind of quiet in the background. Can you talk a little bit about the process that we worked with the White House in order to express our concerns about an executive order, and the way that the one that was leaked out to the media, an early version, one that we know that was extremely early, and it changed considerably. Your thoughts of it and where we are today?
Well, we were at the point when that document was leaked, we were already in conversations and had been for some time with the White House on uh, mostly in a mode of them trying to gauge what our reaction would be to certain provisions as they contemplated what would be included in the executive order. Now, it's important to understand, and I know most people do, that executive orders do not have the force of law. So any executive order that is promulgated by the White House um, is going to be somewhat limited in its scope and in its reach. For example, in terms of scope, the doctrine of qualified immunity cannot be addressed by executive order, and therefore it's not included in the executive order. The provisions of Section 18 USC 242 cannot be directly addressed in the executive order. What can be done is that the administration can mandate certain behaviors and certain policies for the law enforcement agencies, which are part of the federal government. Most of them housed in the Department of Justice and in DHS, but as you're aware, there are also components in other parts of the executive branch. For example, the U.S. Park Police, you know, and a number of other uh, federal law enforcement entities, agencies have their own special agents or uniformed officers. National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration does. The Federal Food and Drug Administration does. The Environmental Protection Agency does. So there are a good number of federal officers who can be directly affected by this. Also affected, and this is while it's indirect, it's of concern to us, would be anyone, a state and local officer acting in a task force capacity on a federal task force who's been deputized as a special deputy U.S. Marshal. They would be affected in the sense that they would be held to these same provisions of the executive order that other federal officers were being held. And we worry that if these requirements are too onerous, then state and local agencies are going to pull out of these task forces, which are vitally important, not just to the federal government, but to state and local governments as they provide a real synergy and create a false force multiplier in areas of significant concern in any given community, whether it be gun violence, rampant drug trafficking, or what have you. And so and further, the degree to which state and local governments would look at this executive order and embrace elements of it uh, for inclusion in state or local legislation, as has been the case with things like qualified immunity and so forth up to this point. So we have a tremendous interest, as well. We have a significant number of federal officers in our membership too, and a lot of people lose sight of that. And we have their direct concerns, plus the task force officers, plus the indirect concerns of all of our members, and they're well placed. So we have a very, very significant role in these conversations. And they asked us and the International Association of Chiefs of Police to consult with them with an agreement that we would do so confidentially, and we have done so confidentially and will continue to. However, we're talking here about the executive order draft that was leaked, which is not the one that not anything that we have contemplated in our meetings. In fact, we haven't actually physically seen a draft executive order in these meetings, but I can tell you that what we have discussed is significantly different from what was contained in the leaked draft. But it provided a springboard for a conversation, And the White House gave interviews to the media last week, which led to a greater understanding of the kind of dialogue that's been going on and the kinds of things that have been discussed and where we stood. And here again, there are a number of areas in which we are willing to continue to have discussions. We talked about, our proselytizing and putting forward the use of force best practices, our willingness to have conversations on no-knock warrants and possible tightening down of the requirements, but not eliminating them, because there are certain circumstances where they're vitally important to officer safety, but tightening down the requirements for getting or requesting and getting a no-knock warrant. The credentialing and certification of law enforcement agencies to ensure that law enforcement agencies are all as close to full performance at the highest levels of the profession as is possible. A decertification registry of officers who have been decertified for conduct that is far beyond what's tolerable in any law enforcement officer, with the clear understanding, and we have fought extraordinarily hard for this. We're happy to say that everybody understands that it's got to be there to get our support. The full due process provisions before anyone is decertified, that they'll be afforded every opportunity to provide and afford a defense at every imaginable level, and that's been agreed to. We view decertification of an officer as kind of analogous to getting a dishonorable discharge from the service. It's so final, and it has such a detrimental effect on an individual's life going beyond that point, that we don't want anyone to suffer that end without having every right to defend themselves. After having done so, if they're still found to have committed acts that render them unfit to be a police officer, then we'll support it, but not until they've had exhausted all their rights.
And excellent points. There's one thing, if you look at just look at our past 2 years, look at the environment that law enforcement officers find themselves in. There's a lot of, very, beat up and beat down by so many public officials, and either by their actions or their inactions. And as a result, if you read the initial version, the language, the way it starts off, it is almost would be a turnoff to law enforcement to start with. So if it starts off as to a law enforcement officer, if we're looking for ways to improve the criminal justice system, I think we'll both agree that the way the one that leaked version came out, was going to do little help in trying to build any consensus or any kind of buy-in by law enforcement. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, as you've heard me say, and as the folks we've had these conversations with at the White House have heard me say many times, I firmly believe, and this goes back to my ATF days, that 90% of getting consensus on an issue is in how you present that issue. And the policy statement at the front end of that leaked document is so demeaning to law enforcement officers that any officer who read it would just basically throw the document aside, never even get to the meat of the document, which also has some disturbing provisions in it, but would never get to it. So our counsel to them on that point is, don't be picking winners and losers in your policy statement. We want to be, and candidly, we have to be part of the solution. For any executive order to work on a national basis, law enforcement has to be a full partner in it. And if they're not, just as if the civil rights community is not a full partner in it, it's not going to work, period. So we have stressed that, and we continue to stress that, and we're hopeful that that'll be reflected in the final document, because without it, candidly, I have serious questions about whether it can be successful.
So, Jim, there's a typical Washington fashion. When someone doesn't like the direction something's going, it gets leaked. It gets leaked in a bunch of different directions.
Mm-hmm.
So if I could, I'd like to go back to, we know that the House passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and transmitted over to the Senate side. And in the Senate side, the FOP and IACP worked collectively with our partners in the Senate to work through the concerns that we had. Yet a lot of misinformation was put out in the media about our involvement basically to stir it up a little bit. And I know in our conversations we're both very disappointed that Congress could not finalize something meaningful so we can move past this. But at the same time, if you could just talk a little bit about what our involvement has been in that process, putting all the misinformation that was released aside, and what our hopes were, and how far did we get in this process, and how did it unfold?
Well, and you're right about leaks. It almost seems to be beyond coincidental that at a critical juncture in talks with the House and Senate on criminal justice reform legislation, an early draft, which candidly we had never seen, was leaked, and it sent the entire community, not just ours, but the civil rights community and everybody else, into a furor, and it turned into a big media debate, and ultimately, I think, played a huge role in sinking and ending the potential for any meaningful legislation to be passed. And so here we are with the Biden administration trying to develop an executive order, and we're moving along, and we're having thoughtful conversations, very collegial, with a White House that wanted our input. And all of a sudden, this draft here again that we had never seen gets leaked, and it's a good thing that we hadn't seen it probably at the front end, because we would have walked away too. But it wasn't there. We have been steadfast, as I said earlier, in what our red lines are, and unfortunately, those red lines fall in areas that are areas that the civil rights community seems to have its mindset have to be included in the final executive order. Well, the fact of the matter is that for the final executive order to get done in a way that it'll be successful, as I just alluded to, you're going to need us, and you're going to need the civil rights community. You're going to need some political support behind it. And without those three things, it's just doomed to the dustbin of history. But we need to get around. We need to work in those areas we can. The civil rights community, to whatever extent their agenda finds common ground with ours, we need to work in that area. We need to practice the art of the doable, and we need to it's going to be narrower, and it's not going to contain everything that we want or that the civil rights community wants. But in that band between us, there is an awful lot that can be done that will enhance public and officer safety and go a long way towards improving trust and collaboration, which is important between officers and the citizens they're sworn to serve and protect.
Well, Jim, one thing that we can't ignore, America can't ignore, is that crime is going up in cities all across this country. It's not a coincidence, I think, that a lot of the ones that are doing the most extreme changes to the criminal justice system, the defunding movements, the downsizing their police departments, reimagining their police departments, are seeing the greatest crime. But the reality is, at the end of the day, what we're looking at is that there are real people involved in this. This is not a political issue. Often people make their decisions on where they stand and feel on something based on their political ideologies. But in reality, we're talking about tens of thousands of murders across this country that are involving real people. So there's a need for us to get it right. There's a need for law enforcement and all leaders, community leaders, to come together and build confidence and trust back into law enforcement, and let us do our job. Everyone wants a safe community. So our role involved in this has been just that. Do you have any thoughts on, add to that statement?
Yeah, I think that to a degree we're headed in that direction right now, in a very positive way. I think that the fact that in spite of all the media attacks and the constant drumbeat of criticism by opportunistic politicians against police officers and policing, uh, the, the fact that our members and police officers everywhere are just strapping them on and getting out there every day and doing their jobs as only they know how and only they can do, has made a huge difference. It sent a huge message to the community that, hey, these people aren't in it, for the just the politics and the appearances of it. They're in it to win it, and that coupled with the fact, this is kind of one of the perverse elements of the cyclical feelings on law enforcement is there's been this huge spike in violent crime at about the same time that people had been hollering about defunding the police. Well, there were people who were inclined to agree with them. Well, maybe let's try it and that kind of thing. And all of a sudden, their communities are besieged and beset by violent crime, and they're no longer safe in the streets, in the neighborhoods, in their schools, even in their churches. And they're saying, we need the cops. We really need the cops. So I think with respect to defunding the police, that ship has sailed, and it's sailed long since. I think that battle as a political battle is over, and it's nothing left but a tired accusation slung back and forth by politicians running for local office. This federal government, this administration, has offered enhancements in the COPS program and in justice grants that are historic in terms of their levels. And the support for police at the state and local level is increasing. We're facing an existential crisis in terms of the number of people willing to apply for law enforcement positions. The attrition rate is at an all-time high. The retirement rate year over year is up 45%, according to some recent polling. And these are things that aren't going to be turned around in 2-3 years. This may be generational. But the cops who are out there on the street now form an extraordinarily good base for starting. And that's what we've got to do. The fight is going to be harder than it's ever been. But our people have shown that they've got the resolve for that fight. And I give them all the credit in the world. And that's what makes me happy to get up in the morning and go to work representing them here in Washington.
No doubt, no doubt. Well said. In this environment, if you just think about it, our the future of law enforcement really depends on attracting and hiring the best and brightest for the next wave of law enforcement. What's happening, what we've seen happen in the last 2 years has had taken a huge impact on people wanting to choose law enforcement as a profession. So the very people who want to reimagine are really part of creating a crisis that's going to be looming for 4 or 5 years, because that's what it takes for a new officer to become an effective officer after all the training and all. Jim, you make an excellent point. As we wrap this up, you make an excellent point in the fact that we see cities that are struggling with a lot of crime, a lot of problems, and they're the ones that are allowed us on the defunding and a lot of these changes. But at the same time, we can look at cities across this country who are just as big, but don't have those same crime problems. But they don't have some of the same changes that they wanted to implement. So I think there's proof to that. So with that, Jim, thank you very much for coming and sharing some insight of what's happening here in Washington. It's a very difficult time for law enforcement, but if anything, I hope our members recognize that we are very much engaged in trying to make some meaningful improvements to the criminal justice system, so that we can provide the best quality service for our communities, at the same time keeping them safe and our jobs safe. Would you like to make any final thoughts on where we are and basically where we're heading?
Yeah, I think that at this point, and again, these things tend to be cyclical. Law enforcement in the mid 90s, when the 94 Crime Act was passed, they're among the most popular people in the United States of America. 2-3 years ago, we probably were at one of the low points in my recollection in terms of the public perception of law enforcement and law enforcement officers. Today, you can see that ticking back up at an accelerated rate as people come to see the value and the necessity for having good, highly paid, qualified law enforcement officers out there. And our role is to educate, not just support our members, but to educate the public on the vital nature of the work that law enforcement officers do, and the vitally important role that the public can play in supporting those officers, and not just in political terms, but in terms of talking to them on the street, letting them know where the problems are, letting them know what the concerns are in a neighborhood. Community-oriented policing. It's a two-way street. It'll make the country a safer place, not just for the citizens, but for the police officers as well. And we play an important role in that, again, defending our members, yes, but also in educating the public on the role of those members and how they can be supportive and helpful to them. So I think for the next couple of years, politics aren't going to get any easier. You know, there's a toxicity level on the Hill that just gets worse all the time, and I'm not sure what will turn that around. But I can tell you this: whatever the toxicity level, the FOP will be in there slugging and hoping for the best. And we have a tremendous track record, and it's not just me; it's the Washington staff, it's the succession of leaders that we've had at the national level that have ensured that, one, that we're relevant, two, we're on the right side, and three, that ultimately we're successful. And that's what we've got to keep striving to do.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's some great information you shared. It really comes down to this. There are some 800,000 men and women who suit up and show up every day in communities across this country and make a difference in the lives of the people they serve. And so you see a law enforcement officer, reach out, tell them hello, thank them for their service, because this is some of the most challenging times I've seen in my 36 years of law enforcement, and I'd venture to say probably in our history. Yet it's brave young men and women who show up every day and make that difference. So thank you for Jim again for sharing with us, and thank you to our viewers for paying attention to such an important challenge in a law enforcement profession right now and being part of that solution. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of The Blue View, hosted by Patrick Yoes, National President of the Fraternal Order of Police. To catch our next episode, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review. To get the latest from the National FOP, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at GLFOP and on Instagram at FOP National. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.